If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1: The Birth of an Empire, Unification and Rise of Genghis Khan. Part 1: Temüjin's Turbulent Youth and Rise. 1162–1206. In 1162, a boy named Temüjin was born into a world of constant violence and betrayal on the Mongolian steppes. His father Ögedei led a small clan, but their lives changed forever when Temüjin was just 9 years old. Ögedei was poisoned by rival Tatars during what should have been a peaceful meal. The news reached their camp like wildfire, and suddenly, young Temüjin found himself thrust into leadership of a clan that was already fracturing. The death of Ögedei triggered immediate chaos. Other clan members abandoned Temüjin's family, taking their animals and leaving them to face the harsh steppes alone. His mother Holin struggled to keep her children alive through bitter winters with little food or shelter. They ate roots, fish, and whatever small game they could catch. This period of desperate survival taught Temüjin lessons about loyalty, betrayal, and the brutal reality of power that would shape his entire approach to leadership. During his teenage years, Temüjin faced capture by the Tayachid clan, who saw him as a potential threat. They locked a wooden collar around his neck and kept him prisoner. But he managed a daring escape during a feast when his captors were drunk. This experience showed him both the importance of seizing opportunities and the value of having allies who would help in desperate moments. As Temüjin grew stronger, he began forming strategic partnerships. His childhood friend Jamuka initially served as an ally, and together they raided other clans and built their reputations as fierce warriors. Temüjin also married Berta from the Angara tribe, which brought him valuable political connections. However, when Berta was kidnapped by the Merkits, Temüjin's response revealed his emerging leadership style. He gathered allies and launched a devastating attack that not only rescued his wife, but demonstrated his ability to inspire loyalty and execute complex military operations. The friendship with Jamuka eventually soured as both men sought dominance over the Mongol tribes. Their rivalry split the steppes into opposing factions. While Jamuka relied on traditional noble bloodlines for legitimacy, Temüjin attracted followers through merit and shared success. He promoted capable warriors regardless of their birth, creating a new kind of loyalty based on competence rather than family ties. Through decades of warfare, negotiation, and strategic marriages, Temüjin gradually absorbed rival clans. He showed remarkable ability to turn enemies into devoted followers, often sparing conquered leaders who submitted completely, while destroying those who continued to resist. His growing army adopted new tactics and technologies from defeated foes, becoming increasingly formidable with each victory. By 1206, Temüjin had achieved something unprecedented in Mongol history. The fractured tribes that had warred for generations were finally united under single leadership. The stage was set for a gathering that would formally recognize this achievement and launch one of history's most extraordinary conquests. Part 2: The Kurultai and the Proclamation of Genghis Khan, 1206. In the spring of 1206, something extraordinary happened on the windswept steppes of Mongolia. The scattered tribes that had fought each other for generations gathered at the headwaters of the Onon River. They came not for battle this time, but for a ceremony that would change the world forever. The Great Assembly, called a Kurultai, brought together tribal chiefs, shamans, and warriors from across the Mongol lands. These were the same men who had once led separate clans against each other in bloody feuds. Now they sat together under the vast sky, united by their respect for one man, Temüjin, the warrior who had managed to do what no one thought possible. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. White felt banners fluttered in the wind as thousands of horses stamped restlessly nearby. The shamans performed ancient rituals, reading signs in the smoke and declaring the moment blessed by the eternal blue sky that the Mongols worshipped. This was more than politics, it was sacred. When the formal moment arrived, the tribal leaders stood as one. They proclaimed Temüjin as their supreme ruler, but they gave him a new name that captured their grand ambitions: Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. The title wasn't just ceremonial. It carried the weight of absolute authority over all Mongol tribes and the promise of something much bigger. Genghis Khan understood that this moment marked a beginning, not an ending. He immediately set about organizing his new empire with the same strategic mind that had won him the throne. He restructured the military, breaking up old tribal units and creating new ones based on loyalty to him personally. Farmer enemies found themselves fighting alongside men they had once tried to kill. The new Khan also established laws and customs that would bind his people together. He promoted based on merit rather than birth, elevated capable warriors regardless of their origins, and created a system where talented individuals could rise through the ranks. These weren't just administrative changes. They were revolutionary ideas that gave his empire strength and flexibility. But perhaps most importantly, the Kurultai of 1206 gave Genghis Khan something he had never possessed before: complete legitimacy. No longer was he just a successful tribal leader fighting for survival. He was now the divinely appointed ruler of a unified people, with the moral authority to demand absolute obedience and the power to punish those who defied him. As the ceremony concluded and the tribes began to disperse, everyone understood that the old world of scattered, feuding clans was gone forever. In its place stood something unprecedented: a unified Mongol nation under a single leader with unlimited ambitions. The stage was now set for campaigns that would carry Mongol warriors far beyond the steppes, into lands they had never seen, against enemies they had never imagined fighting. Part 3. Early Conquests and Subjugation of Neighboring Tribes, 1206 to 1209. With the tribes now bound under his authority, Genghis Khan faced his first test as supreme ruler. The scattered enemies who had tormented the Mongols for generations still lurked beyond their borders, waiting for any sign of weakness. The new Khan knew that unity meant nothing without the strength to defend it, and strength could only be proven through victory. The Tatars became his first target. These were the people who had poisoned his father decades earlier, the ones who had sold Mongol children into slavery and raided their camps without mercy. Genghis Khan gathered his warriors and told them this would be more than conquest, it would be justice. The Mongol army that rode against the Tatars was different from anything the steppes had seen before. Instead of the chaotic tribal raids of the past, disciplined units moved in perfect coordination, following orders that came from a single mind. The Tatars fought bravely, but they faced an enemy transformed. Mongol cavalry struck like lightning, retreating before the enemy could respond, then circling back to attack from unexpected directions. When the dust settled, Tatar resistance crumbled, but Genghis Khan's revenge went beyond mere military defeat. He ordered the systematic elimination of all Tatar males taller than a wagon wheel, ensuring that this ancient enemy could never threaten the Mongols again. The surviving women and children were absorbed into Mongol tribes, their identity erased forever. The Merkits came next. These were the people who had once kidnapped his wife Berthe, triggering years of bitter conflict. The Khan's forces surrounded their camps and showed no mercy. Every Merkit warrior who had participated in raids against the Mongols paid with his life. Their herds, their weapons, their very way of life became Mongol property. With each victory, Genghis Khan refined his methods. Defeated enemies who submitted completely were welcomed into the growing empire. Those who resisted faced total destruction. This simple choice, submit or die, became the foundation of Mongol expansion. Skilled craftsmen, experienced warriors, and useful leaders from conquered tribes found new homes within Mongol ranks. The rest disappeared into history. The speed of these campaigns shocked neighboring peoples. Within 3 years, every major threat along Mongolia's borders had been eliminated or absorbed. Traders began crossing Mongol territory safely for the first time in living memory. The steppes, once fractured by endless feuds, now lay quiet under a single rule. As reports of these victories spread beyond the steppes, distant kingdoms began hearing whispers of a new power rising in the north. The Mongol war machine had found its rhythm, and Genghis Khan's ambitions were growing with each triumph. Mongolia's borders were secure, but the Khan's eyes were already turning toward richer lands that lay beyond the desert, toward the great cities and wealth of China itself. Part 4. Breaking the Jin Dynasty, the campaigns against northern China, 1209 to 1215. In 1209, Genghis Khan faced his first true test against a settled civilization. The Jin Dynasty controlled northern China, a realm of massive cities, sophisticated armies, and wealth beyond anything the Mongols had ever seen. Unlike the nomadic tribes of the steppes, the Jin possessed stone fortresses, advanced weaponry, and millions of subjects. Their capital at Beijing stood behind towering walls that had never fallen to barbarian attacks. The Khan understood that conquering China would require different tactics. His horsemen excelled in open battle, but Chinese cities presented a puzzle his traditional methods could not solve. The first Mongol raids into Jin territory met fierce resistance. Chinese generals, experienced in fighting steppe nomads, used their fortified positions effectively. They forced the Mongols into costly sieges that dragged on for months. Genghis Khan proved his genius lay not just in warfare, but in adaptation. He captured Chinese engineers and forced them to teach Mongol warriors the secrets of siegecraft. Soon, Mongol armies rolled massive catapults across the steppes. They learned to build siege towers and use gunpowder weapons. The nomads who had once known only horses and bows now wielded the most advanced military technology of their age. The transformation showed immediate results. City after city fell as the Mongols combined their mobility with Chinese siege techniques. They would surround a settlement, cutting off all supply lines, then pound the walls with captured artillery. When defenders weakened, Mongol cavalry would pour through the breaches like a flood. The siege of Beijing became the ultimate test. The Jin capital held over 1 million people behind walls 40 feet high. Chinese generals commanded armies that outnumbered the Mongols 3-1. Yet Genghis Khan had learned patience from his Chinese captives. He surrounded the city completely, starving its population while his engineers prepared their assault. Month after month, the siege tightened. Disease spread through Beijing's crowded streets. Food prices soared beyond reach of common families. The Jin emperor watched helplessly as his great city slowly died. Chinese soldiers, once confident in their superior numbers and fortifications, began to desert in growing waves. In 1215, Beijing's walls finally cracked under the relentless bombardment. Mongol warriors poured into the streets, discovering treasures that exceeded their wildest dreams. The wealth of northern China, silk, gold, silver, and precious stones, filled countless wagons heading back to Mongolia. More importantly, thousands of Chinese craftsmen, scholars, and administrators became Mongol subjects, bringing invaluable knowledge to the expanding empire. The fall of Beijing sent shockwaves across Asia. The Jin dynasty, once considered invincible, lay broken. news of the Mongol victory reached distant kingdoms from Korea to Central Asia. A new power had emerged that could destroy the greatest cities and mightiest armies. The wealth seized from northern China would fund even larger campaigns, while captured Chinese knowledge would make the Mongol war machine unstoppable. Part 5. Expansion into Central Asia and the Khwarezmian conflict ignites, 1218 to 1221. The wealth flowing from conquered China transformed the Mongol Empire into something far more dangerous than before. With Chinese engineers and siege equipment now at his disposal, Genghis Khan cast his eyes westward toward the vast trading networks of Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia, controlling the profitable Silk Road trade routes that connected east and west. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a peaceful trading caravan of 450 merchants to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. These weren't just traders. They were also diplomats carrying a message of friendship from the great Khan himself. The Mongol leader genuinely hoped to establish profitable trade relationships rather than wage another costly war. The caravan carried precious goods from China and Mongolia, representing enormous wealth and goodwill. Inalchuq, the governor of Otrar, made a catastrophic decision. Suspicious of the merchants and convinced they were spies, he ordered the entire caravan seized and every merchant executed. The vast wealth disappeared into his coffers, and the diplomatic opportunity died with the massacred traders. When news reached Genghis Khan, his fury was absolute. The Khwarezmian Shah's refusal to hand over the guilty governor for punishment sealed his empire's fate. The Mongol response came swift and merciless. In 1219, an army of 200,000 Mongols swept into Khwarezmian territory like a devastating storm. Their first target was Otrar itself, where Governor Inalchuq had committed his fatal mistake. The siege lasted 5 months, ending with Inalchuq's particularly gruesome execution. Molten silver poured into his eyes and ears as punishment for his greed. Bukhara fell next in 1220. The Mongols arrived outside this great center of Islamic learning and trade with terrifying efficiency. Citizens watched in horror as their leaders fled, leaving them defenseless. When the city surrendered, Genghis Khan reportedly rode into the main mosque, climbed the pulpit, and declared that he was God's punishment for their sins. The city burned for days, its famous libraries and schools reduced to ash. Samarkand, perhaps the jewel of Central Asia, suffered an even worse fate. Despite having 100,000 defenders, the city fell within 5 days. The Mongols had perfected their siege techniques using Chinese knowledge, and their psychological warfare proved equally effective. Survivors described streets running red with blood as the Mongols systematically eliminated anyone who might resist future rule. These campaigns revealed the Mongol war machine at its most efficient and terrifying. Cities that submitted were often spared, while those that resisted faced complete destruction. The speed of conquest was unprecedented. Entire regions fell within months rather than years. The Khwarezmian Empire, once a major power controlling crucial trade routes, simply ceased to exist. The destruction sent shockwaves across the Islamic world and beyond. The Mongols had demonstrated they could annihilate even the most prosperous civilizations with stunning speed. Trade routes that had operated for centuries lay in ruins, and millions of people had perished. Yet from this devastation, the Mongols began building something entirely new, a unified system that would eventually restore and expand trade across the largest land empire in human history. Chapter 2. The Great Khan's Legacy, Consolidation and Expansion under Ögedei. Part 1. The Death of Genghis Khan and Ögedei's Ascendance, 1227 to 1229. In August 1227, the great conqueror's body lay still in his camp near the Shishia kingdom. Genghis Khan, the man who had united the scattered tribes and built an empire stretching from Korea to the Caspian Sea, was dead. His passing sent ripples of uncertainty across the vast territories he had claimed. The question that haunted every Mongol noble was simple, yet profound. Who could possibly fill such enormous boots? The empire faced its first major test. Unlike settled kingdoms with clear rules of succession, the Mongols followed their ancient tradition of the Kurultai, a gathering of chiefs and nobles who would debate and choose the next leader. But this was no ordinary succession. The stakes were higher than ever before, with millions of people and countless riches hanging in the balance. Genghis Khan had already made his wishes known. Among his 4 sons, he had chosen Ögedei, his 3rd son, to lead after him. This choice surprised many. Ögedei was not the eldest, nor was he the fiercest warrior, but the dying Khan saw something others missed. Ögedei possessed a calm wisdom and diplomatic skill that the empire would desperately need. The Kurultai convened in 1229, 2 years after the Great Khan's death. During this time, Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, served as regent, keeping the empire stable while the nobles deliberated. The gathering was massive, with representatives from across the empire traveling for months to reach the meeting place. The air buzzed with tension and political maneuvering. When the votes were counted, Ögedei emerged as the unanimous choice. The decision reflected both respect for his father's wishes and recognition of his own abilities. The new Great Khan understood the enormous challenge ahead. He inherited an empire that was still expanding, with armies scattered across distant frontiers and newly conquered peoples who remained restless. Ögedei's first priority was proving he deserved the title. Unlike his father, who had built his reputation through decades of warfare, the new Khan had to establish his authority quickly. He faced skeptical generals who had served his father, and nervous subjects who wondered if the empire would fragment without its founder's iron grip. The new leader showed his wisdom immediately. Instead of trying to be another Genghis Khan, he embraced his own strengths. He focused on organization and administration, understanding that ruling was different from conquering. Where his father had been the sword, Ögedei would be the steady hand that shaped the empire into something lasting. This transition period revealed both the strength and vulnerability of the Mongol system. The Kurultai had worked, confirming legitimate leadership and preventing civil war. Yet the 2-year gap between rulers had slowed expansion and allowed enemies to regroup. Ögedei inherited momentum that was beginning to fade, and he knew he had limited time to reignite the empire's conquering spirit while building the structures needed to govern such vast territories effectively. Part 2. The Mercy and Might of the Golden Horde. Conquest in Eastern Europe, 1236 to 1241. Ögedei wasted no time in proving his worth as the new Great Khan. By 1235, he had reorganized the empire's military structure and was ready to test Mongol might on multiple fronts. His choice for the most ambitious campaign fell to his nephew Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and leader of what would become known as the Golden Horde. The target was Eastern Europe, a region of scattered principalities that had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. Batu Khan assembled a massive force of nearly 150,000 warriors, supported by the brilliant military mind of Subjugai, the general who had served Genghis Khan with devastating effectiveness. Their first major target was the city of Ryazan in 1237. The Russian princes, divided by centuries of feuds and political rivalry, could not unite against this foreign threat. Each principality fought alone, making them easy prey for the coordinated Mongol war machine. The siege techniques that had worked in China proved equally effective against Russian fortifications. Mongol engineers used catapults and siege towers, while mounted archers circled the walls, creating chaos and terror among defenders. Ryazan fell within 6 days. The pattern repeated across the Russian lands as city after city surrendered or was destroyed. Moscow, then a small trading post, was burned to the ground. Vladimir, capital of a powerful principality, lasted only 4 days against the Mongol assault. The speed of conquest shocked European observers, In less than 3 years, the Mongols had swept through territories that had taken centuries to develop. The crown jewel of this campaign was Kiev, the ancient heart of Slavic civilization. In December 1240, Batu Khan arrived at its gates with siege engines and an army that stretched beyond the horizon. The city's defenders, led by Prince Michael, knew they faced impossible odds. The 6-month siege became a symbol of resistance, but even Kiev's massive walls could not withstand Mongol persistence and engineering skill. When Kiev finally fell, Batu Khan showed both mercy and calculation. Rather than completely destroying this important trade center, he spared those who submitted and rebuilt parts of the city under Mongol administration. This approach became a hallmark of the Golden Horde's expansion, mixing devastating military action with practical governance. Emboldened by success, the Mongols pushed westward into Poland and Hungary in 1241. At the Battle of Mohi, they destroyed a Hungarian army of 60,000 men. European knights, trained for individual combat and heavy cavalry charges, proved helpless against Mongol mobility and tactical discipline. Panic spread through Western Europe as reports arrived of an unstoppable Eastern army. Yet suddenly, at the moment of greatest triumph, the advance stalked. News reached Batu Khan that Great Khan Ögedei had died in Karakorum. According to Mongol law, all princes had to return for the Kurultai that would choose the next ruler. The European campaign, which might have reached the Atlantic Ocean, ended abruptly as the Golden Horde turned eastward toward home and political uncertainty. Part 3. The Fall of the Jin Dynasty and the Campaign against the Southern Song, 1234 to 1279. While Batu Khan withdrew from Europe following Ögedei's death, the Mongol war machine continued grinding forward in China. The Jin Dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, faced its final hour. These Jurchen rulers had already lost most of their territory to Mongol forces, retreating steadily southward as their cities fell one by one. By 1234, the Jin held only a few strongholds around their capital of Kaifeng. The last Jin emperor, Aizong, watched his empire crumble from within the city walls. Mongol siege engines pounded the fortifications, while disease and starvation weakened the defenders. The emperor knew the end had come when his own generals began deserting to join the Mongols. In a desperate final act, Aizong passed the imperial seal to his nephew and then took his own life. The nephew ruled for exactly 1 day before Mongol forces breached the walls. The Jin dynasty died with him, ending 119 years of Jurchen rule over northern China. The Mongols now controlled everything from the Yellow River to the Great Wall. Yet China remained divided. South of the Yangtze River, the Song dynasty still ruled from their capital at Hangzhou. These ethnic Chinese rulers had actually allied with the Mongols against the Jin, believing they could reclaim their lost northern territories once their Jurchen enemies fell. They would soon learn how wrong they were. The Song possessed advantages the Jin had lacked. Their territory featured rivers, canals, and marshlands that favored defenders over the mounted Mongol cavalry. Song engineers had developed powerful crossbows and early firearms that could stop charging horses. Most importantly, the Song navy controlled China's waterways, something the landlubber Mongols struggled to counter. Mongol attacks on Song territory began almost immediately after the Jin collapse. However, these early campaigns met fierce resistance. Song forces, fighting for their homeland rather than a foreign dynasty, proved far more motivated than Jin troops had been. The difficult terrain slowed Mongol advances, while Song fortifications proved harder to crack than anything the Mongols had faced. The war dragged on for decades. Each Mongol advance came at enormous cost, while the Song adapted their tactics to exploit Mongol weaknesses. The conflict became a test of endurance rather than the lightning campaigns that had characterized earlier Mongol conquests. Chinese resistance forced the Mongols to evolve from raiders into administrators, learning to govern settled populations while maintaining their military edge. This prolonged struggle would reshape both empires. The Mongols discovered that conquering China required more than superior cavalry and siegecraft. They needed to master naval warfare, urban administration, and the complex art of ruling the world's most populous civilization. The Chinese learned that even their ancient kingdom could fall to foreign invaders who adapted and persevered. Part 4. The Rise of Karakorum and Empire-Wide Administration, 1235 to 1246. The conquest of China taught the Mongols a crucial lesson. Ruling an empire required more than winning battles. As Ögedei Khan consolidated power in the 1230s, he faced the monumental task of governing territories that stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. The solution emerged in an unlikely place, a modest settlement in the heart of Mongolia that would become the nerve center of the largest land empire in history. Karakorum began as little more than a collection of felt tents near an ancient crossroads. Ögedei chose this location deliberately, placing his capital at the intersection of trade routes that had connected east and west for centuries. Unlike the grand stone cities of China or Persia, Karakorum reflected Mongol practicality. The Great Khan wanted a headquarters that could coordinate his vast empire while remaining true to nomadic traditions. The transformation began with infrastructure that would make modern governments envious. Ögedei established the Yam, a postal relay system that connected distant corners of the empire through a network of stations spaced a day's ride apart. Riders could cross the entire continent in weeks, carrying messages between Karakorum and provincial governors. Fresh horses waited at each station, ensuring that imperial orders traveled faster than any army. This communication network enabled something unprecedented: centralized administration across multiple continents. From his palace in Karakorum, Ögedei could coordinate tax collection in China, monitor campaigns in Europe, and settle disputes in Central Asia. The system worked because the Mongols understood that information was as powerful as cavalry. The Great Khan also launched the empire's first comprehensive census. Mongol officials traveled to every province, counting people, livestock, and resources. This wasn't mere bureaucracy, it was revolutionary governance. For the first time, rulers knew exactly what they controlled. Tax assessments became fair and predictable. Military recruitment could be planned systematically. Provincial governors could no longer hide resources or inflate expenses. Karakorum itself reflected the empire's diversity. Chinese architects designed buildings using Persian techniques, while European craftsmen worked alongside Muslim scholars. The city became a melting pot where different civilizations contributed their expertise to Mongol administration. Ögedei encouraged this cultural exchange, knowing that the empire's strength lay in absorbing the best from every conquered people. Legal reform accompanied administrative innovation. The Mongols created uniform laws that applied throughout the empire while respecting local customs. A merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad, knowing that Mongol law protected his goods and contracts. This legal consistency encouraged trade and prosperity across the empire. Yet challenges remained enormous. Governing nomads and farmers required different approaches. Chinese bureaucrats understood taxation, but not tribal loyalty. Persian administrators knew irrigation, but not steppe warfare. Ögedei had to balance these competing needs while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. The empire's sheer size created constant communication delays, despite the postal system. Rebellions could fester for months before news reached Karakorum. Provincial governors gained dangerous autonomy simply through distance. The Great Khan's authority depended on keeping his subordinates loyal while they controlled territories larger than most kingdoms. As Karakorum grew into a true imperial capital, it symbolized both Mongol adaptation and ambition. The empire had evolved from a collection of raiding tribes into a sophisticated government capable of managing diverse populations across 3 continents. Yet this transformation also created new vulnerabilities that would soon test the empire's unity. Part 5: Succession Struggles and the Pause in Western Expansion, 1241–1246. In December 1241, as Mongol forces prepared to push deeper into Europe after devastating Hungary and Poland, urgent news arrived from the distant capital of Karakorum. Ögedei Khan, the great Khan who had ruled the vast Mongol Empire for 13 years, was dead. This single event would instantly transform the course of world history, forcing the mighty Mongol war machine to grind to a halt just as it stood poised to conquer Western Europe. Batu Khan, leading the Western campaigns, faced an impossible choice. Mongol law demanded that all major military leaders return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would choose the next great Khan. The armies that had terrorized European kingdoms suddenly found themselves bound by tradition stronger than their desire for conquest. Within weeks, the fearsome generals who had seemed unstoppable began their long march eastward, abandoning campaigns that might have changed European history forever. The death created a power vacuum that revealed the empire's greatest weakness. Despite its sophisticated administration and vast postal network, the Mongol Empire remained fundamentally dependent on the personal authority of one man. Without Ögedei's steady hand, the carefully balanced relationships between his relatives and generals began to fracture. His widow, Turigene, claimed the right to serve as regent, but this move angered other branches of the royal family who had their own candidates in mind. Gayuk, Ögedei's son, seemed the natural heir, but he had made enemies during his father's reign. His conflicts with Batu Khan during the European campaigns had created lasting resentment. Meanwhile, Tolui's sons, particularly the brilliant Monke, had proven themselves capable leaders and enjoyed strong support among the military. The stage was set for a succession struggle that would consume the empire's attention for years. The Kurultai itself became a political battlefield. Turigene used her 5 years as regent to build alliances and eliminate opponents. She promoted loyal supporters to key positions and gradually isolated those who opposed Gayuk's claim. The assembly that finally met in 1246 was as much a coronation as an election, but the damage to Mongol unity was already done. The European campaigns, once the empire's most promising frontier, became a forgotten priority. This pause proved fatal to Mongol ambitions in the West. European kingdoms used the breathing space to strengthen their defenses and forge new alliances. The moment of opportunity, when Mongol military superiority could have overwhelmed a divided Europe, passed forever. The empire's attention turned inward, consumed by family politics and succession disputes. The events following Ögedei's death demonstrated how quickly even the mightiest empire could stumble. The Mongols had conquered half the known world, but they could not conquer the human tendency toward rivalry and ambition. As Gayuk finally took the throne in 1246, he inherited an empire that was still vast and powerful, but no longer seemed unstoppable. Chapter 3: The Fragmentation and Clashes. Division of the Empire and Regional Powers. Part 1: The Empire Divides. Formation of the Khanates, 1250s to 1260s. When Mongol Khan died suddenly in 1259, the vast Mongol Empire faced its greatest crisis. The Great Khan's death created a power vacuum that would tear apart the largest connected land empire in history. Within months, the unity that had held this massive territory together for decades began to crumble. The trouble started with succession. Mongol tradition demanded that the Kurultai, their great assembly, choose the next Khan. But with territories stretching from Eastern Europe to China, Gathering leaders became nearly impossible. Two of Mungke's brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, both claimed the throne. Each held their own Kurultai and declared themselves the rightful Great Khan. This split created ripple effects across the empire. Local commanders and regional governors had to choose sides. Many picked based on their own interests rather than loyalty to tradition. Distance made communication slow and difficult. A message from China to Persia could take months to arrive, making coordinated rule almost impossible. The empire naturally broke along its stilt lines. In the west, the Golden Horde controlled the Russian steppes and Eastern Europe. These Mongols had grown comfortable with tribute systems and local partnerships. They saw little reason to take orders from distant relatives in China or Mongolia. Central Asia became the domain of the Chagatai Khanate, named after one of Genghis Khan's sons. These Mongols maintained more traditional nomadic ways, but found themselves caught between the growing power of their cousins in China and Persia. In the Middle East and Persia, the Ilkhanate emerged under Hulagu Khan. These Mongols faced unique challenges ruling settled populations with ancient civilizations. They needed different approaches than their steppe-dwelling ancestors had used. Kublai Khan eventually won the struggle with his brother, but his victory came at a cost. He controlled the Yuan dynasty in China, the richest part of the old empire, but the other Khanates increasingly acted independently. They still acknowledged family ties and shared Mongol heritage, but practical cooperation faded. Geography played a crucial role in this division. The empire had simply grown too large to govern as one unit. The steppes that had once connected distant territories now seemed like vast barriers. Different regions had different needs, different enemies, and different opportunities. Each Khanate began adapting to local conditions. The Golden Horde learned to work with Orthodox Christianity and Slavic customs. The Ilkhanate grappled with Islamic traditions and Persian administrative systems. The Yuan dynasty absorbed Chinese governmental practices. What had been one empire became four related but independent powers. Family relationships remained, and trade continued between regions. But the age of unified Mongol rule was ending. The great experiment in world empire was giving way to something new. Regional powers that blended Mongol military tradition with local customs and needs. This transformation would define the next century of Eurasian history. Part 2. Kublai Khan and the Rise of the Yuan Dynasty in China, 1260 to 1294. Kublai Khan faced a challenge no Mongol leader had encountered before. When he claimed leadership over the eastern portion of the divided empire in 1260, he inherited not just vast territories, but the complex task of ruling China's millions of settled farmers and city dwellers. Unlike his grandfather Genghis Khan, who could move freely across the steppes, Kublai needed to govern from palaces and manage bureaucracies. The young Khan made a bold decision that would transform both the Mongols and China forever. Instead of ruling as a foreign conqueror, he chose to become a Chinese emperor. In 1271, he declared the establishment of the Yuan dynasty, taking on the role that Chinese rulers had held for centuries. This wasn't just about changing titles. Kublai was attempting something revolutionary, blending Mongol military power with Chinese administrative wisdom. The transformation wasn't easy. Many traditional Mongols viewed Kublai's changes with suspicion. They watched as their leader adopted Chinese court ceremonies, built permanent capitals, and surrounded himself with Chinese advisors. Some questioned whether he was still truly Mongol. Meanwhile, many Chinese scholars and officials remained skeptical of their new Mongol emperor, wondering if he could truly understand their ancient traditions. Kublai proved remarkably adaptable. He established his capital at Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, creating a magnificent city that impressed visitors from across the known world. He maintained Mongol military traditions while incorporating Chinese civil service systems. Chinese officials worked alongside Mongol generals. Confucian scholars advised on governance while Mongol customs influenced court life. The economic challenges were immense. China's economy depended on agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship, rather than the pastoral herding that sustained steppe societies. Kublai had to learn about rice cultivation, canal systems, and urban markets. He invested heavily in infrastructure, repairing the Grand Canal and expanding trade networks. His administration collected taxes in grain rather than livestock, managed massive irrigation projects, and oversaw complex urban economies. Military campaigns continued throughout his reign. Kublai's forces completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, finally unifying the country under Mongol rule. However, his ambitious naval expeditions against Japan failed dramatically. Typhoons destroyed his invasion fleets twice, demonstrating that Mongol military prowess had limits when facing nature's fury and unfamiliar terrain. By 1294, when Kublai Khan died, he had created something unprecedented, a Mongol dynasty that functioned as a legitimate Chinese government. The Yuan dynasty controlled the world's most populous and economically advanced region. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. Foreign merchants like Marco Polo marveled at Chinese cities under Mongol rule. Yet tensions remained beneath this success. The Yuan dynasty represented a fundamental shift from nomadic conquest to sedentary administration. While Kublai had proven that Mongols could govern complex civilizations, his achievement raised questions about identity and tradition that would continue to challenge his successors as they balanced Mongol heritage with Chinese expectations. Part 3. Mongol incursions into the Middle East and defeat at Ain Jalut 1260. While Kublai Khan consolidated his power in China, his cousin Hulagu Khan faced a different challenge in the west. The Ilkhanate, stretching across Persia and into Mesopotamia, had swept through the Islamic world with devastating efficiency. Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, had fallen to Mongol forces in 1258. The Caliph was dead, and Islamic resistance seemed broken. Hulagu's armies pressed forward into Syria. Damascus opened its gates without resistance. Aleppo surrendered after brief fighting. The Mongols appeared unstoppable as they advanced toward Egypt, the last major Islamic power in the region. Their reputation preceded them, and fear spread through the Muslim world like wildfire. But the Mongols faced an unexpected enemy, the Mamluks of Egypt. These former slave soldiers had seized power in Cairo and built a formidable military machine. Unlike other Islamic rulers, they refused to submit. Sultan Qutuz declared that Egypt would stand and fight. The situation grew more complex when Hulagu received urgent news from Mongolia. The great Khan Mongke had died, and succession disputes demanded his attention. Hulagu departed for the Mongol heartland, leaving behind only a small force under his general Kitbuka. This decision would prove catastrophic. In September 1260, the two armies met at Ain Jalut, a spring in Palestine. The Mamluk forces, led by Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars, faced roughly 20,000 Mongol troops. The Mongols had never lost a major battle in the Middle East, and their confidence ran high. The battle began with typical Mongol tactics. Their mounted archers launched waves of arrows while feigning retreat to draw the enemy forward. But the Mamluks had studied Mongol methods carefully. They had prepared for exactly this approach. When Kitbuka's forces pursued what appeared to be retreating Mamluks, they fell into a carefully planned trap. Hidden Mamluk units struck from the flanks while the main force wheeled around to attack. The Mongols found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. Kitbuka fought bravely but fell in the fierce combat. His army collapsed, and survivors fled northward in panic. For the first time, a Mongol army had suffered complete defeat in open battle. The victory transformed the Middle East. Mamluk forces quickly recaptured Syria and expelled remaining Mongol garrisons. The myth of Mongol invincibility lay shattered on the battlefield at Ain Jalut. More importantly, the defeat established permanent limits to Mongol expansion. Egypt remained independent, preserving a center of Islamic power and culture. The Mamluks would rule for centuries, while the Ilkhanate gradually adopted Persian and Islamic customs. Ain Jalut marked a turning point where the age of unlimited Mongol conquest ended. The empire had reached its maximum extent, and future expansion would prove increasingly difficult as enemies loaned to counter Mongol tactics and local rulers. Part 4. The Mongol Invasions of the Indian Subcontinent, 1297 to 1320. The defeat at Ain Jalut had shown that Mongol armies could be stopped, but the descendants of Genghis Khan were not ready to abandon their dreams of conquest. 40 years later, the Ilkhanate turned its attention toward another wealthy target, the Indian subcontinent. The Delhi Sultanate, established by Turkish Muslims in northern India, controlled vast territories rich in gold, spices, and agricultural wealth. For the cash-strapped Mongol rulers of Persia, India represented an irresistible opportunity to replenish their treasuries through plunder and tribute. The first serious Mongol expedition crossed the Indus River in 1297 under the command of Kutlug Khwaja, an ambitious general serving the Chagatai Khanate. Unlike the swift cavalry charges that had conquered China and Persia, this invasion immediately encountered unexpected obstacles. The monsoon rains had turned the landscape into a muddy quagmire, slowing the Mongol horses and making their traditional mobility tactics nearly impossible. The humid climate proved devastating to both men and animals accustomed to the dry steppes and highlands. Sultan Alauddin Khilji of Delhi had learned valuable lessons from Mongol defeats elsewhere. He fortified key cities with massive stone walls and stockpiled supplies for lengthy sieges. When the Mongols approached Delhi itself, they found gates sealed shut and defenders prepared for a long standoff. The city's walls stretched for miles, punctuated by towers bristling with archers and catapults. Mongol siege tactics, effective against the wooden palisades of Russian towns, proved inadequate against these massive stone fortifications built to withstand determined assault. The Mongols established camps outside Delhi's walls, but their position grew increasingly precarious. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles across hostile territory, constantly harassed by local forces. Disease spread rapidly through the Mongol ranks as tropical illnesses claimed soldiers unused to the climate. Food ran short as the siege dragged on through months of sweltering heat and torrential rains. Recognizing the futility of their position, the Mongol commanders negotiated a face-saving withdrawal. They accepted tribute payments and withdrew across the Indus, claiming victory while privately acknowledging failure. Subsequent raids between 1299 and 1320 followed similar patterns. Mongol forces would sweep into northern India, defeat field armies, and besiege major cities, only to withdraw when faced with determined resistance and logistical nightmares. These repeated failures marked another clear boundary to Mongol expansion. The Indian subcontinent, like Egypt and Western Europe, proved that geography and local adaptation could neutralize traditional Mongol advantages. The Delhi Sultanate survived and eventually flourished, while the Mongol Khanates turned their attention to consolidating existing territories rather than pursuing costly foreign adventures that yielded diminishing returns. Part 5. Internal strife, religious shifts, and cultural exchanges, 13th to 14th century. As the 14th century dawned, the vast Mongol Empire faced challenges that expansion and conquest could no longer solve. The descendants of Genghis Khan now ruled settled populations across 4 continents, but this success came with unexpected complications. Brothers who once shared the same tent now governed separate kingdoms thousands of miles apart, speaking different languages and adopting local customs that would have seemed foreign to their grandfather. The succession disputes that began after Mongol Khan's death in 1259 continued to poison relationships between the Khanates. Each ruler claimed to be the true heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, yet each also needed to adapt to the realities of governing Chinese farmers, Persian merchants, or Russian serfs. Kublai Khan in China wore silk robes and held court in Beijing's Forbidden City, while his cousins in Central Asia still lived in felt tents during winter migrations. These cultural adaptations created identity crises throughout the empire. Young Mongol nobles in Baghdad spoke Arabic and studied Islamic law, while their counterparts in Karakorum practiced Buddhism and Chinese calligraphy. Traditional Mongol shamanism competed with Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism for influence over different branches of the royal family. Marriage alliances that once united the tribes now created complex webs of competing religious and cultural loyalties. However, these same divisions inadvertently created something remarkable. The Pax Mongolica had established safe trade routes from Venice to Beijing, and merchants now moved freely across political boundaries that barely existed on the ground. A Persian trader could travel from Tabriz to Samarkand to Karakorum without changing currency or learning new languages among the ruling classes. Ideas traveled these routes alongside silk and spices. Chinese printing technology reached Europe through Mongol networks, while Islamic mathematical concepts spread eastward into China. European missionaries like John of Montecorvino established churches in Beijing, while Chinese engineers built irrigation systems in Persia. Mongol administrators, trained in multiple languages and legal systems, facilitated these exchanges by creating standardized weights, measures, and diplomatic protocols. The Mongols themselves became the conduits for this cultural fusion. Marco Polo served Kublai Khan for 17 years, while Ibn Battuta traveled safely through Mongol territories from Morocco to India. These weren't isolated examples, but part of a systematic integration of Eurasian knowledge systems that the Mongol administrative network made possible. Yet this openness also accelerated the empire's transformation. By 1300, Mongol rulers were more Persian and nomadic in Iran, more Chinese than steppe-based in Beijing, and more Russian than Mongol in Moscow. The empire's strength had always come from its unity and mobility. But settled administration required different skills and created different loyalties. As the 14th century progressed, these regional identities would solidify further, setting the stage for the empire's eventual fragmentation into independent successor states. Chapter 4. The Decline and Legacy, Collapse and Enduring Impact of the Mongol Empire. Part 1. The Fall of the Yuan Dynasty and Rise of the Ming, 1368. By the 1360s, the Yuan dynasty that had ruled China for nearly a century was crumbling from within. The descendants of Kublai Khan had grown distant from their Mongol roots, trapped in the luxurious courts of Beijing, while their subjects grew increasingly restless. Corruption spread through the government like wildfire, with officials more interested in personal wealth than effective rule. The Chinese people, who had never fully accepted foreign rule, watched as natural disasters struck repeatedly. The Yellow River flooded devastating areas, destroying crops and leaving millions hungry. Peasants saw their Mongol rulers living in splendor while they struggled to survive. Whispers of rebellion began in tea houses and market squares across the empire. Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant's son who had lost his family to famine, emerged as an unlikely leader of resistance. He had joined a Buddhist monastery to survive, then later a rebel group called the Red Turbans. Unlike other rebel leaders who fought chaotically, Zhu understood organization and strategy. He built a disciplined army and won the loyalty of local populations by treating them fairly. The Mongol rulers made critical mistakes that accelerated their downfall. They relied too heavily on Chinese administrators but never trusted them completely, creating resentment on both sides. Heavy taxation to fund their lavish lifestyle and constant military campaigns drained the treasury. When rebellions erupted simultaneously across different regions, the Yuan forces found themselves stretched impossibly thin. Zhu's forces grew stronger with each victory, He captured key cities along the Yangtze River, cutting off vital supply lines to the Mongol capital. His message resonated with ordinary Chinese people: restore native rule and end foreign oppression. Other rebel leaders either joined him or were defeated by his expanding army. The final blow came when Zhu's forces surrounded Beijing in 1368. Emperor Togon Temür, the last Yuan ruler, faced an impossible choice. Rather than fight a hopeless battle, he gathered his court and fled northward to Mongolia, abandoning the mandate of heaven that had legitimized Mongol rule over China. Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed himself Emperor Hongwu, founding the Ming Dynasty. He immediately began purging Mongol influence from Chinese society, destroying records, changing laws, and rebuilding institutions along traditional Chinese lines. The Great Mongol Experiment in China was over, but its impact on Chinese culture, technology, and global connections would persist for centuries. The fall of the Yuan marked more than just a change of dynasty. It signaled the beginning of the end for Mongol power worldwide, as their other Khanates would soon face similar pressures and internal divisions. Part 2. The Waning of the Golden Horde and Fragmentation of Power, 14th to 15th centuries. As the Ming Dynasty consolidated its power in China, the Golden Horde faced its own mounting crisis across the western steppes. The Great Khanate that had once dominated Eastern Europe was slowly tearing itself apart from within. By the late 1300s, the Golden Horde suffered from the same weakness plaguing Mongol Khanates everywhere. Too many claimants fighting for the throne. Brothers turned against brothers, cousins murdered cousins, and powerful generals decided they deserved to rule instead of serve. Each faction controlled different regions, collecting taxes and tribute for themselves rather than the central Khan. The empire that Batu Khan had built was fragmenting into rival camps. The situation grew worse when the bubonic plague swept through the Horde's territories in the 1340s. Entire cities emptied as people fled or died. Trade routes collapsed, cutting off the wealth that had kept the Mongol war machine running. Without steady income from merchants and conquered peoples, Khans could no longer pay their armies properly. Soldiers began deserting or switching sides to whoever offered better rewards. External enemies sensed this weakness and struck hard. The growing power of Moscow challenged Mongol authority in the north. Prince Dmitry of Moscow dealt the Horde a crushing blow at the Battle of Kulakovo in 1380, proving that Mongol armies could be defeated. Though the Mongols regained control temporarily, the psychological damage was done. Russian princes no longer feared their overlords as they once had. Meanwhile, a more dangerous threat emerged from the south. Timur, claiming to be the true heir of Mongol tradition, invaded the Golden Horde's territories in the 1390s. His armies destroyed cities and slaughtered populations, leaving the Khanate devastated. Even after Timur withdrew, the Horde never recovered its former strength. The final blow came from within the ruling family itself. Competing Khans divided the realm among themselves, creating separate Khanates that fought each other constantly. The Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, and the Astrakhan Khanate all claimed to be the true heirs of the Golden Horde. Each ruled only a fraction of the original territory and commanded far fewer warriors. These successor states lacked the unity and military power of their predecessor. They could no longer coordinate massive campaigns or maintain control over vast territories. Local Russian princes gradually stopped paying tribute, while other neighbors picked off border regions piece by piece. The great western extension of Mongol power was withering away, just as it had in China. But unlike the clean break in the east, where the Ming had expelled the Mongols entirely, the western territories would experience a slower, messier decline. The fragmented Khanates would linger for centuries, growing weaker with each passing generation until they too disappeared from history. Part 3. The end of Mongol rule in Persia and Central Asia. While the Golden Horde crumbled in the west, another chapter of Mongol decline was playing out thousands of miles to the south. The Ilkhanate, which had ruled Persia and much of Central Asia for nearly a century, was facing its own death spiral. By the 1330s, the last Ilkhan rulers were little more than figureheads, watching helplessly as their empire dissolved around them. The problem started at the top. Unlike their ancestors who had conquered through unity and discipline, the later Ilkhans spent more time fighting each other than governing. Brothers murdered brothers for the throne. Generals switched sides whenever it suited them. The central government that had once efficiently collected taxes and maintained order simply stopped functioning. Religious tensions made everything worse. When some Ilkhans converted to Islam, they alienated their traditional Mongol supporters. When others tried to return to old ways, they lost the backing of their Muslim subjects. This religious confusion created a perfect storm of rebellion and civil war that no amount of military force could contain. Local governors saw their opportunity. Instead of sending taxes to the capital, they kept the money for themselves. Persian nobles who had served the Mongols for generations began declaring independence. Turkish warlords carved out their own territories. Within decades, the vast Ilkhanate had shattered into dozens of competing mini-states. The most successful of these new powers was led by a man named Timur, later known to history as Tamerlane. Born in what is now Uzbekistan, Timur claimed descent from Mongol nobility and borrowed heavily from their military tactics. He understood that the old Mongol system of administration and warfare still worked. It just needed new leadership. Starting from his base in Samarkand, Timur rebuilt much of what the Mongols had created. His armies swept through Persia, capturing the same cities that Hulagu Khan had taken a century earlier. Timur was building something different. His Timurid Empire kept the efficient tax collection and administrative structure the Mongols had perfected, while adapting to local customs and Islamic law. The transition wasn't seamless. Years of warfare had devastated trade routes and emptied treasuries. Cities that had prospered under early Mongol rule lay in ruins. The sophisticated governmental machinery that had once connected Persia to China and Europe had broken down completely. Yet something important survived. The administrative techniques, legal frameworks, and military innovations the Mongols had introduced didn't disappear with their political power. Local rulers, whether they were Timur's descendants or other successor states, continued using Mongol methods because they worked. The same bureaucratic systems that had governed millions under the Great Khans now served smaller kingdoms across Central Asia. This pattern of collapse and adaptation would define the region for centuries. While the Mongol Empire was gone, its influence on how governments operated, how armies fought, and how different cultures interacted would shape every empire that followed. Part 4. The Mongol Legacy. Impact on Eurasian trade, culture, and warfare. The roads that stretched from China to Europe had never been safer. After the Mongol Empire crumbled into separate kingdoms, merchants still traveled these ancient paths with confidence. The systems Genghis Khan and his successors had built remained in place, even under new rulers. Trade goods flowed more freely than ever before. Caravans carried more than silk and spices now. Chinese paper and printing technology reached European workshops. Islamic mathematical knowledge spread eastward into Mongol territories and beyond. Gunpowder, originally a Chinese invention, made its way westward through Mongol trade networks, eventually changing warfare across Europe. The Mongols hadn't invented these technologies, but their empire had created the perfect conditions for sharing them. In the workshops of Baghdad and the markets of Samarkand, craftsmen combined techniques from different cultures. Chinese porcelain makers learned Persian glazing methods. European metalworkers adopted Asian steel-making processes. This mixing of knowledge happened because the Mongol Empire had brought distant peoples together. Even after the political empire disappeared, these cultural connections remained strong. The military innovations proved equally lasting. European knights encountered new fighting styles through Mongol raids and diplomatic contact. They learned about composite bows, mobile cavalry tactics, and coordinated siege warfare. The Mongol emphasis on speed and surprise influenced military thinking across continents. Armies from Russia to Japan adopted elements of Mongol strategy. Religious tolerance, another Mongol practice, had changed how different faiths interacted. In cities once ruled by Mongol Khans, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and followers of traditional beliefs continued living side by side. This religious diversity became a permanent feature of many regions. Trade centers remained cosmopolitan long after Mongol rule ended. The administrative systems created lasting change too. The Mongol postal relay system, with its network of stations and fresh horses, inspired communication systems across Eurasia. Tax collection methods, legal codes, and record-keeping practices developed under Mongol rule influenced governance for centuries. These practical innovations mattered more to daily life than any military conquest. Most importantly, the Mongol Empire had connected the world in ways that couldn't be reversed. People had learned that distant lands held valuable goods and knowledge. Maps had been drawn, routes established, and relationships formed. The idea that Asia and Europe formed one connected trading system became permanent. When Portuguese sailors later sought sea routes to Asia, they were following economic connections first established under Mongol protection. When Islamic scholars translated Greek texts, they built on intellectual networks the Mongols had fostered. The empire's political power had ended, but its role in connecting civilizations continued shaping global development. The Mongols had created something larger than their military victories. They had shown the world how different peoples could work together for mutual benefit. This lesson would influence empire builders and traders for generations to come. Part 5. Remembering Genghis Khan. Myth, Memory, and Modern Reinterpretations. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he could never have imagined how differently the world would remember him. His name would become a symbol that meant completely different things to different peoples across the centuries. In China, where Mongol rule had lasted nearly a century, memories were complicated. Chinese scholars often portrayed the Mongols as foreign invaders who disrupted their civilization. Yet they also recognized that Mongol rule had brought stability and prosperity to vast regions. This tension between viewing Mongols as destroyers and builders would persist in Chinese historical writing for generations. The Islamic world faced similar contradictions. The destruction of Baghdad remained a wound in collective memory. Religious leaders spoke of the Mongols as divine punishment for the sins of the faithful. But merchants and administrators remembered the peace and prosperity of Mongol rule. Trade had flourished under their protection, and many Islamic scholars had found patronage in Mongol courts. Europe developed its own complex relationship with Mongol memory. Medieval chroniclers had painted them as harbingers of the apocalypse. But as centuries passed, Western writers began seeing Genghis Khan differently. Some portrayed him as a great military genius who had created order from chaos. Others focused on his role in connecting East and West through trade. The most dramatic transformation happened in Mongolia itself. During the 20th century, as Mongolia struggled with its identity between powerful neighbors, Genghis Khan became a symbol of national pride. Modern Mongolians celebrated him not as a conqueror, but as the founder of their nation. His face appeared on money, his name on streets and buildings. Soviet rule had tried to suppress this memory. Communist authorities feared that celebrating Genghis Khan might inspire Mongolian nationalism. They preferred to emphasize class struggle over ethnic identity. But after the Soviet collapse, Genghis Khan returned with unprecedented force to Mongolian culture. Modern scholarship has tried to balance these competing memories. Historians now recognize both the destruction and the innovation of Mongol rule. They study how Mongol policies promoted trade, protected craftsmen, and facilitated cultural exchange. They also acknowledge the massive loss of life that accompanied Mongol conquests. DNA studies have revealed another layer to Genghis Khan's legacy. Scientists estimate that millions of people across Asia carry genetic markers suggesting descent from Mongol ruling families. This biological inheritance connects modern populations to events that happened 8 centuries ago. Popular culture has created its own version of Genghis Khan. Movies, novels, and video games present him as everything from a bloodthirsty villain to a misunderstood hero. These portrayals often say more about contemporary values than historical reality. The process of remembering Genghis Khan continues evolving. Each generation finds new meanings in his story. Some see him as an early globalization pioneer who connected diverse civilizations. Others view him as a cautionary tale about the costs of imperial ambition. His legacy remains as complex and contradictory as the man himself, ensuring that debates about his historical significance will continue shaping how we understand the past and its relationship to our modern world.